So at this time, I want to introduce Jeff Behan. Jeff is a senior policy analyst with the Institute for Natural Resources. He was a major part of this study, and thank you for that, Jeff. And thank you for moderating this panel on the Oceanside case study. So take it away, sir.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Behan. As Mike mentioned, I do work for the Institute for Natural Resources and worked on several aspects of the Trees to Tap project. The upcoming case study, this session is a case study focused on the Oceanside Water District entitled Communication and Coordination Between a Forest Manager, Water Utility, and the State of Oregon. The session will essentially review the story of how stakeholders whose responsibilities involve deriving some very different products from the same forested area were able to open lines of communication and collaborate to work through various issues associated with these different responsibilities. Our first speaker is Dr. E.J. Davis, who you met previously. E.J. will briefly describe the case studies that emerged from her survey of water providers and from which this session is drawn. Thank you, E.J.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll just be speaking very briefly to introduce the concept of the case study. So as social scientists, we can learn some information through surveys, but we also can learn a lot more about something in depth through interviews and going to see a place. So what we did was we wanted to dive deeper into what are those management concerns in these places and how are managers addressing them and what does that look like in the context of particular places. We chose one in each location of our 3 general regions around Oregon. So this one you're going to be hearing about momentarily is in the coast area, the community of Oceanside. We also did one on Ashland, which you'll be hearing about tomorrow in Southern Oregon, representing the Valleys region, and then one of Baker City in Northeastern Oregon, representing the dry side. For each of these case studies, folks took time to show me around and respond to my request for interviews. So I want to thank everyone who did that, including Paul and John, who are going to be speaking next. I'm going to cede most of the time to our speakers, but I wanted to highlight 3 themes that really came up across these 3 very different settings. So in Oceanside, this is really our smallest community that we were looking at, a private industrial timberland context, really different from Ashland and really different from Baker City. But despite all of that, we found a few common themes across these. First is obviously that land ownership in each particular context really does frame the opportunities and challenges for managing source watersheds. So the different laws, regulations, policies, and partnership opportunities provide different standards for management. And so they open up different opportunities and different constraints, land use designations, requirements for public participation in management decisions. All of those really structure the environment for the drinking water provider and landowners to cooperate. As we learned in the survey, we also learned in the case studies that regular communication is a really important foundation for relationships. Keeping source water protection issues on the table, even when landowners and others have other management issues they're trying to deal with. We found that opportunities like field tours and just ways to view the watershed and potential management issues together were really important and set mutual understanding of the key conditions and opportunities. But obviously, we found that the scope and scale of this communication varied by context. And then finally, we noted that specific projects offer the opportunity to collaborate in each case. So maybe forest management activities are planned, causing concern or interest. Source water protection plans offer a process and structure around which there can be collaboration, or a plan for a monitoring or data collection effort also offers those opportunities. So depending on the ownership of the source watershed, providers, drinking water source providers may be able to provide project design input, develop community plans, or create monitoring protocols. So I'll be turning it back to Jeff and over to our panelists to talk a little more about all of these things in the context of Oceanside. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Our first speaker is John Wehage. John serves as Coast Unit Manager for Stimson Lumber Company. John earned a degree in forest engineering at OSU and has been with Stimson Timber for 26 years. He worked in road and harvest layout and contract administration, then transitioned into silviculture. In 2003, John became manager of Stimson's 30,000-acre Cape Lookout tree farm, working as a jack of all trades, managing harvest and silviculture activities on the property. the Coast Tree Farm has since grown to 75,000 acres.
All right.
All right, we see the overall PowerPoint.
All right, yep. All right, welcome. Thanks for the invite, and I have a lot of slides to go through, and I'll go through an overview here because I was burning through my time already. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to Stimson Lumber Company, the Watershed and Watersheds we're working with, some successful forest management, communication, and how did it all go down? How did this happen? And a little bit of the latest research of what's going on out there. So Stimson Lumber, we're a family-owned company dating back to the 1850s and own land in Tillamook County since the 1890s. And we have family members. It's a current CEO. We employ about 750 employees. And our board members say we have a dual obligation, not only to manage the land for timber production, but to manage our natural resources. And we have this mission statement put right into our bylaws. And it says I do two things. I have a forestry job to do out here, but I also have a large responsibility to the natural resources and to protect them. And so with that, a little bit more about Stimson. We own about 170,000 acres in Northwest Oregon. This tree farm here I'm on is about 72,000 acres. It's managed by 4 foresters. We have 3 sawmills, Tillamook, Forest Grove, and Claskanite. Total staff of about 15 on the 170,000 acres. And we plant close to 2 million trees every single year. So the watersheds that we work in, we have 7 community watersheds that we work with. Oceanside and the Cape Mears are the 2 that we're kind of talking about today, but 31,000 acres. And Stimson owns over 14,000 acres of that. And that's 45% of the watersheds. So that's pretty significant. And trying to move some stuff around here. That's very significant to have that much of the watershed committed to your tree farm. So here is Short Creek Watershed, and hopefully my pointer's showing up, but we got Tillamook Bay, the town of Tillamook, Cape Mears, Oceanside, where we're talking about, Netarts. And here's the Short Creek intake down here. And this is our industrial Stimson's timberlands here. We have some other private that's hashed in here that we do not own. But this turquoise color here is 1,325 acres of the Short Creek drainage. And also we have Coleman Creek over here, and that flows down to a tank at Cape Mears, which is also managed by the Oceanside Water District. So the $1 million question, how can I practice successful forestry working in a community watershed? So the obvious is you need to do good forestry. We have the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which, 1972 document, it's been upgraded more than 40 times based on good science. The Department of Agriculture is where we get our pesticide licensing, and they do continuing education and keep us apprised of changes with herbicides and other things, better ways to do business. BMPs, best management practices. Spend time with your contractors, training them, utilize these, setting high standards for their work on your property. I talked a bit about company principles and guidelines and how I use those in my day-to-day decisions, and that's important to me. And SFI principles, there's nothing like going through an SFI audit. If some of you have been through those, it can be grueling. And we've been doing it for about 20 years, and it keeps the SFI standards very fresh in your head. And the last one I have here is utilizing mentors. I've been fortunate enough in my 26 years to have some great mentors on the engineering side of things and on the silviculture side of things. And I think we need to be humble foresters if we're managing on this land and take all the knowledge that we can absorb. So well-maintained roads is just one of those things. And we heard from some of the other speakers was talking about what are the concerns, sedimentation, big one. So maintaining rooms. I have 795 miles of road and well over 4,000 culverts on just this tree farm alone. And so you have to stay on top of that. And one of the big things is having good rock sources. And we maintain over, I have about 20 rock pits that I utilize frequently. And new road construction, not near as much new road constructions as we saw in the summer reports, but still need to maintain those. And those contractors need to use best management practices when doing this and operating around these sound logging practices, again, BMPs, training these guys to operate on these watersheds. And we would be nowhere without good reforestation programs, and Oregon's a front runner in that. And our company has no future if we don't do a good job of that. So there's just plain no excuse, and we put a lot of effort into good reforestation practices. So what's not so obvious about all this, at least to a forester? What is the difference between an introverted forester and an extroverted forester? It's a little tough without a crowd here, but an introverted forester looks at his shoes when he talks to you, and an extroverted forester looks at your shoes when he talks to you. So, the lesson here is that foresters tend to be a little more recluse type individuals, introverted. And we cannot assume that people know what we are trying to accomplish at foresters. You could be the best forester out there, but if you can't communicate that to a watershed, that isn't, it does you no good. You've got to be able to communicate that. And it makes people nervous that we're working around their drinking water. So you really need to do a good job and tell them how you're protecting that. So getting into the communication. Build those relationships. I can't stress enough communication. You need to build the relationships with the water manager, and this may take time. I've got 2 new ones on 2 of our systems that I'm just starting to get to know a little bit, and you got to make an effort, take them out on tours. So talk to them about your forest management goals, long-term and short-term. Do what you say you're going to do. If you say you're gonna fix something or there's a problem, follow through. It's just good business. It builds trust. Meet in the forest, take them on tours, meet with our water boards, give presentations, answer questions. Back in 2014, I think, it was kind of funny. I think I got to know Paul Newman right about that time. And he said, hey, people are getting upset about this roadside spraying you're proposed up here and maybe some harvesting in the future in town. And so it sounded like they were gonna, come get me and tar and feather me and walk me through town. So I decided that it'd probably be a good idea. And in, I think, February of 2014, I went down and gave a presentation to the community center. About 50, 80 people, I think, we crammed in there, and 20-minute presentation about industrial forestry. So, it helps. And we've also done community leaders tours, Tillamook Working Lands and Waters, a grassroots group here. We had during the harvest up in the Short Creek drainage, we had about 50 or 60 people up there, community leaders, showing them how we're working in the community watershed. So educate your community. And remember, don't talk with a forester accent. You can't start rambling off RMA and all these type of things. You gotta educate people, and if they get frustrated or confused, you're going to lose them. And so make it worth your time. So we know that herbicide application is a complicated issue. It's contentious. We use some additional documentation. We've been doing this for about 15 years within our company, and we use this to make sure that we're making the proper communication with the people that need to know it, usually the water system manager, or it could be just a concerned neighbor. But it makes sure that we're compliance with the Forest Practice Act and notification. We highlight agreed upon measures of protection that we're going to do, and it notifies all the parties, the concerned parties that need to be notified. So, and we do this across the board with all of our community water systems. And we notify the water system managers of a herbicide use, a minimum of 15 days prior to the application, preferably 30 days or more. And we give them updates as things change. We let them know on the day of the application, or 1 day prior, then the date of the application, then the start of the application, and when the application is complete. So very important. You miss that and you lose trust. So how did all this go down? Like I said, Paul Newman, I met him about in 2014, and he was representing the Oceanside Water District and mainly concerned about the roadside spray application at that time. But there was additional concern, and so I went and gave a presentation and explained what was going to happen in the future and how we were going to manage on that property, which helped. We went into a 5-year harvest plan at that point, and in May of 2018, I communicated to him that we'd be doing 2 harvests, one in 2019 and one in 2020 in that 5-year period in the 1,425 acre watershed. So we did some road reconstruction and such, and then in 2018 we did a field visit out there with David, Charles, and Paul, which are all on the water board. David is the water master. And I just showed them what we did as far as road reconstruction, rocking, culverts, how we deal with the sediment. And we went and toured that in the winter. I believe there was a little bit of snow on the ground at the time, which is rare for us there, but it was definitely adverse weather conditions. And then we kind of rolled into 2019, and that's when we started doing our harvest plan. And out there, we started doing reconnaissance for the planned short start harvest. And here you can see what we found out there, a couple pictures of small rotations, 1/4 acre, sometimes 300 by 300, 100 by 100, little rotations that had happened years previous, old ones, new ones. We identified, I think, 3 of those. But the point is, we found things and we were able to incorporate them into our protection measures. And just a fun fact, here's Brent Long, who's the assistant manager here. We were both out there that day, and we found a bag of bones laying here on a kind of an old skid trail when we were about done. And apparently a tree had fallen on this bull elk right here. It was about a 4 or 5 point that got pinned down with his horns under a tree, and he perished right there. So you find some interesting things out there, and that's just a little fun fact. But while we're out there looking at these items, we're using LiDAR imagery to do that. And here you see some LiDAR imagery from the Oregon Department of Forestry. He did a review and provided this, and showing some 70% slopes in red here plus. And this was the harvest we were planning. And here is kind of just a quick notes map. We took GPS coordinates out there of what we found, different things, springs, slopes, any excessive slopes and sort. And our old rotations and little things like that. So it works really well to use these tools or tools in your tool bag. Then we had what we call a professional consultation tour. It was with ODF, Josh Seeds, and Brent and myself. Mike Buren is a geotechnical specialist. And I was a bit apprehensive about this, and Josh will probably talk about this next, but I think just reflecting, I'll summarize it up as I think we had a very honest and productive conversation. It was really, we actually had a good time out there and had honest conversation, which is really important. So continuing on, we started the short start harvest. We did that tour, and there was the next one, some road work was being done for the next harvest in 2020. And things like that. And all of this communication, this is only a little bit of the communication that went on between Paul and the water board and so forth, and just a snapshot. But communication, I think, is really, if you think you've done enough, you probably haven't, and you need to do more. So just keep that in mind. And in 2020, we helped with the Oceanside Water. They had a grant from DEQ for roadside spray applications to do some water testing. And we worked with them on that. And that's part of research too. It's down here in 2020. But 3 little items here. 2016, Stimson funded a 2-year paired watershed analysis for aerial application. And it was done by Lucius Codwell and formerly of Kramer Fish and Science, and Lauren Corder with Mountain Hood Environmental. Here's a link to that information if you want to dig into that. That's aerial sprayed, a paired tree study, or paired tree, study. And then in Neatarts with DEQ and Josh Seeds, he might talk to this in 2017, we did a backpack spray application on 77 acres, and he tested that water there. There was no hits on that one, but, and of course, Paul will be talking about the Oceanside program. So thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate everything. It's gonna be fun to listen to.
Great stuff, John. Thanks a bunch for that. I'm reminded in listening to your presentation, something I heard in my undergrad forestry days back in the early 80s when one of the professors admonished us. He said, forestry is a social science. And I think some of your early comments really reinforce that point. Moving on quickly here, our next speaker is Paul Newman. Paul serves as commissioner for the Oceanside Water District. He holds a PhD in physics and worked for 25 years for high-tech companies, including Rockwell International, JBL Professional, and for Electro Scientific Industries here in Oregon. Since retiring in 1992, Dr. Newman has consulted for technology-driven businesses. He also taught at the graduate level for several universities and overseas in Vietnam, Korea, and China. Paul is currently officially retired, but continues to serve on the Oceanside Water District Board of Commissioners. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks for having me. And also a few words. John and Stimson, we have this case you're going to hear about has actually been going on for quite a number of years. And I worked with John's predecessor, Roger Van Dyke. And our communication with Stimson, I would say, has been excellent. And as you'll see, we addressed one particular issue, and that's the one I'm going to concentrate on. The other issue that John brought up, which is to say runoff from clear cuts, is an issue, but that's a whole nother story. There's good news, though. Presumably, Josh Seeds is going to talk about it, but some steps were taken and the results have been excellent. We have had no problems with runoff from clear cuts. But what I'd like to tell you now is a story about another issue, which is herbicide spraying in surface watersheds, and in particular the one that serves our community of Oceanside. As John mentioned, right next to it, and you'll see it in a minute, is another watershed that we depend on, which has Coleman Creek in it, that supplies water to our other treatment plant, which supplies Cape Mears. But I'm only talking about Oceanside at the moment. Project that we carried out has a whole number of people that helped us, and that we're very appreciative to all of them. We had some, when we started out, and in fact, still, our objectives are pretty straightforward. We want to make sure that Short Creek water, as processed by our treatment plant, provides high quality drinking water and whatever for the community of Oceanside. We've been working together with the timber owners and Stimson to ensure the protection of drinking water, while enabling them to carry out profitable forestry management practices. We want to see if it is possible for them to harvest timber and still work with us to protect our water. Those are the strategic objectives. Notice we didn't say prevent them from harvesting. That's not our objective. Issues associated with those objectives are, that I'm going to address in this talk, is current monitoring and testing of surface-derived drinking water for contamination by herbicides adequate? Is it being monitored? Is there any one single agency responsible for monitoring spraying in forested watersheds? Are there cooperative procedural changes that enable the prudent use of herbicides by foresters while still protecting potentially exposed surface water systems? And as John touched on, when I first got involved, and before we really had gotten familiar with one another, there were some people in Oceanside who did not trust, believe in, or anything about Stimson. So one of the issues is the relationship between the forest owner and the surface water providers necessarily an adversarial one. So first, Short Creek, which I'm sitting in front of, is a type F stream. It's in a forested canyon, and you can see the walls are extremely steep. Stimson owns the land, and they have, either John or Roger told me, about 20 miles of gravel logging roads that have to be kept free for both logging operations and for emergency firefighting. The watershed recently has been sprayed. Finally, we were able to carry out the joint experiment where they sprayed herbicides for weed clearing while maintaining infrastructure, culverts, which were made to minimize sediment runoff. I will point out that the water level throughout this watershed varies seasonally. And in fact, only 2 of the creek's principal tributaries have water in July. And moreover, by luck or by clever design, those 2 places are really the only serious places where the logging roads cross a tributary that has water in it. So John probably has a lot better maps than I do, but here's Short Creek. Here's where the intake is to our treatment plant, and also where we sampled. In addition, these are the 2 side creeks, and it's hard to see on here, but there's a road that goes across here, and it's that crossing and this crossing that we were concerned about. So, what regulations apply to taking chemicals up there and spraying them? Well, it turns out there's an OAR regulation which requires testing for things like SOCs, which are synthetic organic compounds. And you can see a list that's on there. And 2,4-D is on there, and glyphosate. Now, it turns out foresters spray different cocktails of up to, I believe, 5 different herbicides and a surfactant, which is also toxic. But the thing is, okay, so you're doing that. How do you monitor that? You know, I trust you like a brother, but verify. So, in fact, it turns out for water systems serving more than 3,300, which is not us, but small systems at 3,300 or fewer, 1 sample every 3 years, and it turns out at a random time. Keep that in mind, random. So here's a little report on our drinking water. And to no one's surprise, there's synthetic organic compounds. Nobody's ever found any using that particular sampling technique. I might also point out that even though the DEQ OHA has a source water test project, they've never taken any water from our creek. So as John pointed out, there are regulations that pertain to spraying through the Forest Practices Act, and they're administered supposedly by the ODF. And the Forest Practices Act requires operators to protect human health and safety and so forth. And in particular, there is buffer requirements. This one that I found was 10 feet, it may be 20 feet, but John has told me that in the spraying action that was utilized for our experiment, they used 50-foot buffers, and that perhaps that's Stimson's normal practice. You'll notice this is a kind of spraying. It's truck mounted sprayer, and the trucks go down the road, spraying the road itself plus the sides to the roads. The requirements that John referred to require the forest manager to notify the water district and the public in general. So they file a thing called a NOAP, and I'll show you that in a minute. But that notification is in effect for up to a year, and their actions can occur anytime in that period. That it turns out to be not very useful for us. In addition, there's an additional requirement, as John pointed out, that the forester has to notify the plant operator of any area using the watershed where they're spraying. Now, here's the NOAP that we worked with. It's filed by one of John's colleagues, Jake Hilder. And one thing I want to point out is he submitted it in April of 2020. It wasn't actually filed until October. What's useful about these things, and I'm sure all of you have seen one of those, what's useful for us in particular, there's a little map that shows, the area. But in particular for us, there's a list of chemicals. Now, what Stimson proposed here is glyphosate, 2,4-D, and triclopyr. It turned out, and John notified us this, that they decided not to use glyphosate. And so the chemicals that were actually sprayed was 2,4-D and triclopyr, and we would not have known that had they not told us directly. So you can see that this is a good idea, and it says there's spraying coming up, but it doesn't tell you when. Now, in particular, in the Short Creek watershed, as I said, they use 2,4-D and triclopyr. But the only compound that was in the list that I showed you before of SOCs that are required to be tested was the 2,4-D. Triclopyr is not in the required list of SOCs being tested. So now, this is the part. Routine OHA DEQ mandated testing, as I showed you before, occurs once at a random time every 3 years. The only actual monitoring of the spraying occurs when an ODF forester, and we've talked to a couple of them, visits the site and observes the vegetation color changes in the area being sprayed. This observation is not simultaneously when they spray. It's typically weeks and months after the operation. And so they conclude from that where the color of the vegetation changes, that's where the spray went. Not necessarily true. No one from any regulatory agency routinely appears on site during the actual spraying. So, okay, what's the risk? Well, as we said, it's a truck-mounted spray, and the guy has a GPS guidance system. He's got a map of all the roads, and furthermore, where the road crosses the creek, there are signs warning signs at the opposite ends of the buffer. So maybe the guy had an oops, and the spray didn't get turned off, and it went, close to where it crosses the creek. The spray may be turned off properly, but airborne spray can drift through the buffer and into the creek, and it can be at a level that's not enough to kill plants, but it's still enough to pollute the creek. Spraying is not a continuous operation. We don't have an herbicide plant manufacturing herbicide up creek. It produces a local slug of polluted water. It may, as the truck goes by, you have a slug of polluted water. What I mean by that is that they'll introduce a slug, and that slug migrates downstream and spreads out and diminishes in height. But the point is, if you're sampling, say down here, it means you need to be there when that slug goes by, or guess what? You're going to get none detected. And that, if you look weeks, months, years afterward, you got none detected. Does that mean there wasn't any herbicide introduced in the water? No, it doesn't. It just means you made the wrong measurement. So as John pointed out, we had a joint experiment where we cooperatively pursued some actions to monitor potential stream contamination in the way I suggested it ought to be done, and that is synchronously with the spraying operations. In our case, we had a large time of transit uncertainty. You remember where the road crossed the creek, and we were sampling what turns out to be 0.8 of a mile downstream. We tried various experiments to test what the time of transit was, and all we could find out, it should have been 20 minutes based on the flow and the distance. We were down monitoring a dye, and we saw nothing for 3 hours. So it's longer than that. So Stimson had agreed to give us 1 week notice of the actual spraying. Actually, they let us know earlier, before that it was going to be in July, then 1 week in advance. So what that allows us to do, and I suggest every water district should do this if they can, have the water master charge up your water storage tanks to their maximum capacity. Then on the day of the spraying, Stimson notified us, the plant operator, who closed the intake to the treatment plant. And we lived off the storage tanks for 3 or 4 days. In our case, that number depends on how many tourists we have in town. We also initiated the experimental sampling. We took grab samples using this automated sampler once every 2 hours for 48 hours following the spray, figuring that would be enough to catch that pulse going through. We also used a second technique, which is called POSIS, and it involves introducing these samples, which are filters. Actually, there's a membrane in there that absorbs the compounds. We put this guy into the water a week before we started. Then on the day, we changed it and left it for 2 weeks after, or for 1 week afterward. Now, I'm happy to report that none of the 48 gram samples or the POSIS filters had any detectable levels of 2,4-D or trichopyr down to the testing of 1 to 5 parts per trillion. So what should we do? What came of this lesson, and what can we recommend changes that should be made? Well, the forest manager should continue to file a NOAP. Absolutely. That tells us what the chemicals are and where the treatment is going to occur. In addition, the forest manager, as Stimson has demonstrated, should communicate directly with the water operations at least a week in advance, as much as possible. The water master is going to fill the reservoirs, as we talked about. POSIS samples goes in, and then on the day of the spraying, the forest manager notifies the water master, who will close the intake, run the system exclusively using the reservoirs, and on the day of spraying, an automated sampling system will be activated to take the grab samples. Post filters are changed and new ones will be left in place at an appropriate time. This is the only way to correctly monitor spraying operations, which are transient operations. There is at present, no single centralized laboratory that is created. If you're trying to manage the whole water system, as one of our other speakers does, these results ought to be made available through a central agency. And there is none. That also should be available to the water districts. You'd be paid for by the government, not commercial labs. So, in summary, surface water drinking, in our opinion, is currently not being adequately monitored with a random sample once every 3 years. It has practically zero probability of capturing a transient event. Many commonly employed herbicides are not on the SOC list, and that needs to be updated to include all herbicides. After the fact observations are not adequate for detecting possible overspray. Even though there's enough to kill vegetation, there's maybe enough left to, by a breeze, blow over and contaminate the stream. Samples definitely need to be taken synchronously with the spraying. This requires the notification, as we talked about, added safety, we talked about turning off the intake, etc. In this recent experimental case, close and effective cooperation between the timber owner and our water district has demonstrated to show significant action to enhance the safety in using herbicides in the surface watershed. And again, we recommend that the state of Oregon set up a central laboratory that provides the testing capability for all of the water districts. Thank you.
Great stuff, Paul. Again, thanks a bunch. I'd like to say at this juncture, we may not have time for a lot of questions or really any during this session itself, but I urge anyone with questions to post them on the chat function, and they will be recorded, and we'll work to get you answers to those questions. Our next speaker is Josh Seeds. Josh serves as Technical Assistance Coordinator at Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Drinking Water Protection Program. Josh assesses risks and hazards to drinking water sources and works with water systems, landowners, and other stakeholders to reduce risks collaboratively whenever possible. His professional personal background is in ecology, biochemistry, forest management, and Christmas. Take it away, Josh.
All right, thanks, Jeff. I'm going to go ahead and screen share here. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to try to crank through some of the information a little quicker. All right, so hopefully we're up and going. So I'm with the Drinking Water Protection Program at Oregon DEQ. Been there for quite some time. For Oregon's Drinking Water Program, it's split between two agencies. Oregon Health Authority has primacy under the Federal State Drinking Water Act, which means that OHA regulates contaminants in treated drinking water to make sure it meets the limits set under the Safe Drinking Water Act. As Paul indicated, that's not going to regulate all relevant contaminants. It's only a subset. There was amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act passed by Congress in 1996 to require source water assessments, like Stephanie referenced, and a multiple barrier approach. So what a multi-barrier approach is, filters at the treatment plant are one barrier, set of barriers, and that's part of it. But the water source and its inherent water purification processes is the first and foremost barrier. So in the multi-barrier approach, we want to look to all those different barriers, including the ecosystem that's providing the water. So DEQ's Drinking Water Protection Program is the other part of the state's drinking water program. We did source water assessments and do protection activities for surface water. OHA works on groundwater. Pollution and contamination of surface water is regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act and related state law. So that's Oregon Revised Statutes 468B, generally speaking, the Forest Practices Act for forestry. The basic division of labor here is that DEQ is responsible for water before the intake. OHA is responsible for the water after the intake for the treatment and distribution. Generally speaking, if water is clean enough to meet water quality standards, it should be treatable with existing technology. Of course, there's always caveats and details. The water quality standards for turbidity and sediment that we have in Oregon are very narrative and general. They're not specific to drinking water as a designated use. And then treatment techniques and resources are going to vary widely among water systems. Not all treatments the same, not all treatments have the same capacity to remove contaminants like sediment and turbidity or organic carbon and so on. And, you know, again, Stephanie at Lincoln City did a really excellent job of describing the challenges that come with changes to water quality. So the risks, and this doesn't mean that it always happens everywhere, the risks to water quality, particularly from forestry and changes in forest ecosystems that provide water, are going to be from sediment, so surface erosion or mass wasting landslides. That interferes with treatment, fills intake pools, can shelter pathogens during disinfection. Natural organic matter like organic carbon and nutrients, foul treatment systems can result in disinfection byproducts if that organic carbon mixes with chlorine for disinfection. Flow changes, and then stream temperature, which stream temperature means a lot for fish. It means less for drinking water. But it can increase the risk of harmful algal blooms where nutrient and flow conditions are conducive to that. So Oceanside, I've got a vicinity map that's part of Oceanside's updated source water assessment here. It's, you know, out on the Cape there, west of Tillamook. It, you know, population, so on. It uses Short Creek. They do have a water right on Coleman Creek, which is ironically shorter than Short Creek. And the Oceanside Water District is currently serving itself and Cape Mears as well. They have a membrane filtration plant, and they don't really use Coleman Creek. I'll give a brief detail why. So they don't have any source redundancy. Short Creek is what they have for their water source. So the source water assessment, it includes a delineation of the drinking water source area, IDs potential contaminant sources. Not all of these here are at Oceanside. Most of them aren't, in fact. Any known deep-seated landslides, streams with erosion-prone soils, and then additional information that we had that wasn't in the source water assessment that came into use for Oceanside was LIDAR slope data, an analysis of it, and then, you know, of course, the scientific literature on erosion processes that the Trees to Tap project looked at in detail. Here's a few more pieces of info from the source water assessment. So the map on the left is land use and potential contaminant sources. You're going to notice it's all one color because the land use is industrial forestry for Oceanside. They've also got quarries and rock pits that have been something of an issue. So that's in the southeast corner up there. You'll see some little circles. Those are quarries. And so this is initially how DEQ was in contact with Oceanside and in contact with Paul with some stormwater issues with a quarry in the upper reach that was not related to forestry directly. Map on the right is erosion severity, erosion hazard severity from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I think the take home here is that there's a lot of severe erosion hazard here. So that makes the type and extent of management in the watershed very, very important for water quality. On this side is map, so the leftward map, the kind of beige shading is where there's known deep-seated landslides. So a couple things should stand out here. One is that there aren't really any in Short Creek, which is good news because that can be unstable terrain that's sometimes actively moving. Coleman Creek, that other water source I mentioned on the north side of Short Creek there, almost all of it's a deep-seated landslide, and that is actively creeping along to where it's impacting the road and the intake there. So as an alternate water source, it's not a very good option right now. The right side is this analysis of LiDAR data that we did to show potential slope instability. So the red stippling is slopes that, because of their overall gradient, combined with whether they're shaped to collect or disperse water, are prone to sliding. And so there's kind of a green blob that you'll see towards the right side of the map. That was the short start harvest unit that I worked on with Stimson and Oceanside. So one thing, if you can see it on this map, is that there's a lot of red in that canyon down near the intake and everything on the left, but short start harvest unit itself has very little of that terrain that's so steep as to be highly likely to be unstable. So that was good news. So the initial situation there at Oceanside, there's no harvest for a considerable amount of time. It was all in existing timber cover for the most part. There was already open communication between Stimson and Oceanside Water District and DEQ staff. We were already active and interacting with the Water District because of the quarry issue, questions about roadside herbicide use and so on. And then as kind of a little fun thing, DEQ had put on a source water protection workshop in Tillamook on the North Coast. And at that workshop, it was attended by John Wayhodge with Stimson Lumber and Scott Gray, his manager. And I talked to both of them. In fact, Scott approached me and struck up a conversation. And, we sort of made a verbal agreement there that we would try to collaborate on source water issues. And so that kind of almost not quite happenstance contact, because Scott did approach me. And I try to talk to everyone at those things. So I ended up jabbering at John for a bit. Ended up mattering when it came to it, and relationships do matter here. So Stimson proposed a clear-cut harvest in the drinking water source area in 2019. Oceanside asked for us to review and be involved in it. So I reached out to Stimson, first John, and then Scott Gray, and they went for it. I suggested that maybe I should go out and take a look at the unit, see if we could see what was what, and work together to get everyone on the same page, or at least in the same book. So we went out 2019, went out and did some field work along with the ODF folks, Mike Buren, the geotechnical specialist, the stewardship forester went out, but also ODF's district forester for Tillamook. So we sat down in the ODF office in Tillamook, looked at we shared the spatial data that we had, looked at the LiDAR photos, and then we went out and evaluated the harvest plans in the field. So this map shows those areas that have the red that could be unstable. And the buffers that I'm showing here at the hash marks are the FPA buffers that, 20-foot no cut and then going out 70 or 50 feet, depending on whether it's a medium or small fish stream, to have where you can do some thinning and other management. But Stimson was ahead of me a bit. So John had showed his maps. So they were treating those stream buffers, the whole thing, as no cut buffers already. They already extended those streams to include any seeps and springs and wet soils. There was a moment that was memorable to me when John was showing me where he'd marked out some wet soil, and I said, "Oh yeah, you got Western coltsfoot there." And he looked at me and I looked at him, and we were both, holy crap, this guy knows his plants. I think we had that same thought at the same time. And then he showed you those rotational slides and some of those other features that was riparian adjacent unstable terrain. So not only had Stimson made those RMAs into no cuts, they'd also already proactively extended the RMAs to cover those high risk type of sites. The wet soils, seep, springs, unstable terrain. And then there was he was already going to cluster the in-unit leaf trees around the two non-fish streams on the western edge of the unit, and then kind of up through the middle of it. And then, of course, they'd already done their road maintenance in a precautionary fashion. So what did we find? You'll see some red blobs up by the road on the top of the unit. So there was some oversteep and side casts there that had been put in previously by whomever had built the road. So Mike Buren and I had suggested pulling that material back and removing it somewhere else. I, of course, suggested adding buffers around the non-fish bearing streams to further screen out any sediment and slash tumbling downhill into them. And then as a long-term piece, not particular to this harvest, but to how much harvest would happen within the source area in general, I'd suggested, considering not having too much area open up at once so that we didn't have watershed level flow effects happening. And so that third one's a longer term thing that has to do with their long range harvest planning. But after some discussion, John agreed to add those first two things in. They pulled back that road material and put it somewhere stable, and they put their leaf trees around those non-fish streams and added some buffering. And that was hard for. It was one of those kind of honest conversations where everyone was a little uncomfortable. John and I both knew some trees were going to blow down. For example, for me, that's a source of large wood for the stream system in the long run, and a way to screen out and sort sediment. For John, that's lost trees that he's unhappy to see as a forester. So, the different viewpoints mattered, but we talked our way through it. And so what worked there was that we had established relationships between all of us, and we'd all worked at it and pushed outside of our comfort zone. There was a lot of information between all the parties, and we brought it forward and shared it together. The harvest unit itself was chosen to be in an area that had, didn't have a lot of unstable terrain to work around. And then some of it is particular to the way Stimson operates. It's a privately held company by a few families, some of whom some members of those families I've met, and they give their foresters what I referred to as latitude to exclude. They could leave trees out of harvest for resource protection purposes above and beyond the Forest Practices Act requirements. And so as a result, they were already implementing additional risk reduction measures as a regular thing. I went in there, and a lot of the stuff I would have had to ask for: can you protect the seeps and springs? Can you watch out for wet soils? Can you put those riparian adjacent unstable areas into the buffer? All that was already done before I got there. So in terms of the highest priority sites for risk reduction, I was fiddling around the edges. And so that helped a lot. To have Stimson already, going above and beyond in that way. And then, again, we were willing to get out of our comfort zone a little bit, all of us talk and have some back and forth, because we have different priorities. My priority is going to be minimizing any kind of risk to the water source. Stimson needs to meet, their economic goals and their wood production goals, in addition to their responsibility to protect the resource. So we have a different balance there, and we had an honest talk about it and came out to, I think, a pretty good place. There was continued communication throughout harvest operations, and that did help build trust. They even took me out with some of the owners of the company for a trip, and that was good to talk to the people who have the ownership interest there. That helped as well. They took great care in picking their harvest operator and making sure that they were going to kind of almost behave like a tree gardener, being very careful about minimizing disturbance, taking their time and doing a good job. And then in this particular case, there was minimal pre-harvest understory in the forest. So there was a reduced chance of severe competition for the young seedlings. So no aerial herbicide application was necessary as part of site prep or tree release. And that has the effect of reducing community concern a lot, because, that's something that, whether it's getting in the water or not, it just gets people kind of upset. And that's all I got. I'm hoping to leave opportunity for questions. So last slide is just contact info for our program. And, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great, Josh. Really interesting perspectives shared there. Really appreciate it. We are fairly short on time, but we begged, borrowed, and stole a little bit of extra time. And I'd like to pose one question to the panel before we close out. And that is, what were the major stumbling blocks for the various stakeholders in this case to work together? And if there were some, how were they overcome? Not sure who wants to take a crack at that one, but please somebody do.
I'll start and then let John or Paul jump in. You know, the major stumbling block is that from what I think is that it's hard to have an interaction, you know, with a landowner who you don't know them, and you know, I'm not in sales for a reason. I'm a scientist because, like John's Forester joke, I do often tend to be an introverted. And so I'm not going to go out and cold call a bunch of forestry companies and ask them if I can come look at their harvest units. And, you know, to be frank, they're going to say DEQ on our land. That sounds really risky from a regulatory perspective. But, you know, the fact that Paul and John were already talking, and Paul had been talking to John's predecessor, and the fact that, you know, basically Scott Gray at Stimson was willing to come up to me at a drinking water source protection workshop, one of those pre-COVID, getting out there, getting social, talking about things together in an informal environment, and say, hey, you know, there's a lot of heat going on around forestry and drinking water out there. A lot of people in industry and communities and environmental groups worked up and angry. We should really look at talking and collaboration, and just taking that opportunity. You know, it scared the crap out of me, but I took it and it worked out. And, you know, that's, I think, being willing to make that leap and assuming other people have good intent, and then just watching your feelings when it gets to it, right? I feel strongly about resource protection. That's why I'm at DEQ. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't be listening to John, because he also does. That's why he's a forester. We just have different viewpoints.
If I could interject, the relation with Stimson when I first started, it was pretty adversarial. It was, who the hell are you guys to tell us how to run the forest? And we will only listen to you if you talk science to us. Well, fortunately, I had done quite a bit of research. And when we started talking and they felt that we actually did understand the science behind all of the issues that we're trying, it improved significantly. Also, when it became clear that we weren't, you know, we want to prevent you guys from cutting any trees, and there's all kinds of animals that, no, that's not what we were talking about. And once we understood one another, I think it went a lot better. And I would like to think that our relationship right now is pretty good.
Yeah, thanks, Paul and Josh. I think, you know, the biggest stumbling blocks is almost always, again, that's what I presented on, was communication, and lack of information getting to the public. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's why we spend a lot of time, you know, doing tours and presentations to communities. It's not something I really enjoy, but it's necessary to do, and you got to stretch yourself a little bit. And so I would encourage anybody having these things is to get people out there. And, you know, what forester doesn't like to go out on a field tour, though, and that you can do and have a casual conversation. And I think that's where most of the, I think, good work was done here in this situation here.
Excellent. Thank you all. I'd like to thank everyone here for such a great panel. It's been fascinating for me personally to hear this. In the work that I've done for this project, a lot of this stuff we hear about, the importance of communication, the importance of collaboration, but it's kind of in the abstract a lot of times. So hearing how it can play out in a positive way on the ground in a particular instance, in a particular watershed, is really, really interesting. So thank you all again.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, panel. It was excellent. So our next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the breakout rooms, and you're already assigned one. And when Shannon hits the button, we'll all go to our breakout rooms. And what will happen is a little click will come up on your screen that says Shannon invited you to breakout room, whatever. You just click on that. You'll be there. Your facilitator would take you through, and you'll get a warning at 5 minutes, and there will be a countdown clock at the last minute, and it'll say return to main room. You click on that and you'll be back here. And we're a little behind schedule, but Lisa Gaines has graciously said, let's take it out of the report out. So have the full time for the breakouts, and we'll have the full time for the next panel. So Shannon, send us to our breakout rooms.